Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here and be able to share with this prestigious group some of the work that we've been doing in biosensors and in general medical technologies that we think can have, or at least do have, the potential for impact in sustainable health and social care. So my background is in material science, primarily biomedical engineering. So I'm trained as an engineer, but much of the work that we do is at that rich boundary between engineering and medicine. And we have deep engagements across the clinical community here in Chicago, and in fact, around the world. And so what I'll do with this talk is to try to just give you a flavor for the technology enablement, some of the ideas that have turned out to be powerful for us during the 15-year period that we've been working on these technologies, but really focus on what they're good for, what their state of technology readiness is, and what they look like when they're deployed at scale on vulnerable populations. And I'll focus in particular on beginning of life and end of life. So describe to you some of the things that we're doing in advanced monitoring of maternal, fetal, neonatal, pediatric care. And then on the other end of that age spectrum, devices that we've configured for facilitating rehabilitation of stroke survivors who suffer from aphasia and or dysphagia. And then relatively new effort for us, but building on technologies that we've been working on for a very long time. We've really tailored new classes of devices specifically to symptoms associated with COVID-19 for protecting frontline healthcare workers, monitoring the progression of patients who have contracted the disease, and also potentially sort of monitoring level of infectiousness by indirect measurements of aerosol production. So that's the kind of overview. As I mentioned, I'm an engineer, but I have an appointment in our Feinberg School of Medicine in neurological surgery. I don't do surgeries. You wouldn't want me to do a surgery, but we work very closely with many of the neurosurgeons and many of the other sort of clinical disciplines that cut across our entire School of Medicine. So what I'll be talking about is kind of a next generation of a wearable technology, going sort of qualitatively beyond wearables as they exist today. And if you take a look at the commercial availability of wearable technology, it's quite impressive. There are many different platforms that are available, but they all share a common engineering paradigm. It's a rigid block of electronics, heavy, planar, loosely coupled to the body, typically at the wrist, and there are emerging devices that take the format of a ring. These are great for counting steps, measuring activity, maybe a gross kind of approximate assessment of sleep patterns. But the absence of an intimate body interface really frustrates the ability of these technologies fundamentally to collect clinical grade physiological parameters. And that's kind of the problem that we've been working on, from the standpoint of bioengineering and material science. And what we envision is, a technology that looks qualitatively different from the kinds of integrated circuit components that form the guts and the enabling components in these conventional type of wearables, constructed on rigid semiconductor wafers, planar, they're brittle. They really dominate the overall form factor, the physical properties of wearables, and prevent them from being realized in the kind of thin skin-like formats that you might ultimately want to achieve in order to reproduce and recapitulate sort of ICU grade measurements in a home setting. And so that fundamentally translates into a challenge in the realm of material science and biomedical engineering. How do you reformulate microsystems technologies like the silicon integrated circuit, optoelectronics, microelectromechanical systems, photonic circuits to look more like biological tissues is sort of an overarching goal in our programs of research. And it turns out that there are fairly simple concepts that allow you to do that. So the integrated circuit has the mechanical properties and the geometries that it does, primarily because of that semiconductor wafer platform as a substrate. It's essentially like a plate of glass in terms of the geometry and the mechanics, the stiffness, the relatively brittle construction. But a couple of simple ideas in material science allow you to sort of bypass those constraints. One of them just involves a recognition that the bending stiffness of any piece of material is determined not only by the intrinsic mechanical properties of that material, but also the geometry of the material structure. And so silicon is a very stiff, brittle material. A silicon wafer has those properties partly because the silicon does intrinsically, but also because the wafer itself is fairly thick. It's about 1 millimeter in thickness. And if you reduce the thickness down to sort of nanometer scales, you end up with a form of silicon that's highly flexible. And that begins to get you closer to sort of a biocompatible form of electronics technology. The next idea that you add on top of that simple concept that thin means flexible is that you take these thin pieces of silicon and you bond them to an underlying soft elastomer substrate. And you do that in a non-planar sort of wavy configuration. What you end up with is a hard, soft material composite that has effective, soft, elastic properties, just like an accordion bellows. You can stretch, you can twist, you can bend, you can compress this kind of composite in a way that doesn't induce fracture in the silicon, because those out-of-plane wavy geometries can change and adapt to accommodate the large strain deformations that are being imposed on the entire system. So pretty simple ideas, but you can add all sorts of engineering elaborations on top of those concepts to begin to build very sophisticated devices that have mechanical properties, geometrical configurations, precisely tailored to those of a desired point of integration with the human body. So in fact, you can exploit not only this simple out-of-plane wavy geometry, but you can exploit in-plane buckling as well in the form of these thin filamentary serpentine ribbon mesh type structures where you embed all the electronic functionality on that mesh framework, integrate it with a soft silicone elastomer tailored to the properties of the skin, for example, and you can engineer these systems explicitly to have mechanics that are highly compatible with soft tissues of the body. The result of all of that is a sophisticated technology platform that can embed not only integrated circuits, but advanced digital biosensors, radio communication capabilities, radio frequency harvesting for delivering power, all in platforms that are tailored to have physical properties precisely matched to those of the epidermis itself. So stiffness, thickness, bending rigidity, transepidermal water loss, sort of permeability, thermal mass and thermal load, all very much like a second skin type of system, an artificial skin that integrates with natural skin in a way that's essentially physically imperceptible, yet is able to recapitulate the kinds of measurements that are done in the hospital today, even ICU grade monitoring. And a lot of the engineering involves not only the material science, the circuit design, but also the mechanics design. So you really have to define these systems with quantitative guidance from modeling so that you can ensure that the overall system can deform across the full range of deformations that they need to accommodate in order to allow for natural daily activities and motions associated with the skin. So you put all that together, you can build skin-like devices not only that are physically matched to the skin, but sort of topographically matched to the rough surfaces of the skin as well. Is another advantage of this kind of open mesh type architecture. This is a colorized SEM view of one of these mesh structures integrated onto the polymer, a polymer replica of human skin, and you can see the kind of geometric conformality that follows from this kind of design approach. So it turns out you can build many different classes of devices using those basic design rules, recapitulate a lot of the kinds of measurements that are done today with paste-on electrodes and hardwired connections to external boxes of electronics in sort of a temporary tattoo type format, a Band-Aid type format that's fully wireless and mounts on the relevant part of the anatomy for a particular set of application requirements, including the wrist, but not restricted to the wrist. And I'll give you several examples of how that plays out in clinical context. So I won't go through all the details. There's quite a broad portfolio of sensor technologies that can now drop into those types of frameworks. You can do not only heart rate monitoring like you can with a conventional wearable, but you can do continuous ECG monitoring. So the full PQRST waveform, you pick up subtle signs of arrhythmias and so on. You can also do other things that are performed routinely in the clinic that require that skin contact that lie outside of a capability supported by conventional wearable technology, such as skin hydration in the context of dry skin, xerosis cutis, or other kinds of skin diseases. And these devices, allow that kind of measurement to be performed routinely and with quantitative alignment with handheld corneometers that are used today. So electrical, thermal, mechanical as well. So you can do arterial tonometry, so you can measure pressure pulse wave dynamics associated with blood flow through near surface arteries by embedding pressure sensors into these platforms as well. So quite a large library now of sensor modalities that fit into these kinds of platforms. And I won't go through the full details here. We probably published 50 to 100 papers, but there are many other groups worldwide now working on these kind of technologies, adding to the toolbox of capabilities in a very rapid fashion that I think has a real potential for translational impact ultimately on how we think about delivering healthcare. So you can think about these devices generating big data, clinical quality at price points that would allow availability for use in all areas of the globe. And I'll give you some examples of that in the next few slides. So the first clinical need that we decided to focus on, and this started maybe 4 or 5 years ago, is vital signs monitoring in the neonatal intensive care unit, focusing on premature babies, probably the most fragile, also the most precious asset that you would encounter in a hospital environment. Currently done even in the most sophisticated level 4 NICUs here in the US and the UK and other places, really relying on primitive technology that's highly non-ideal for this patient population. It's wired biosensors adhered to the skin with adhesive tapes connected to external boxes of electronics. The skin is not very well developed in these preemies. Applying and removing those tapes on a 24-hour cycle can sometimes lead to peeling and injury of the skin itself. The wires represent a mechanical constraint on natural motions of the baby, and they also prevent the kind of parent-child interactions, the skin-to-skin contact that's known to have a very strong therapeutic benefit for the development of babies at this age of their lives. And so the vision that we put forward maybe four years ago was to take these kind of temporary tattoos, skin-like wireless electronic devices, configure them to reproduce all the kinds of monitoring function that is currently supported by the wired hardware today, to get rid of the rat's nest of wires and all the complications that they impose on even the most routine aspects of clinical care. And so I won't go through the details. It's engineering, details that go beyond the scope of this talk, but you can do all of that with 2 patches, one that goes on the chest, one that goes on the limb. You can recapture all of the vital signs at clinical grade quality. One of the devices going on the chest, so it's measuring ECG at clinical grade quality, comparable to what you see in the wired-based devices. The battery-free, fully wireless, continuous monitoring system, very, very thin. It doesn't require strong adhesives because there are no wires pulling on the device. It's also very thin, modulus match to the skin, thereby eliminating interface stresses that would otherwise try to drive delamination of this device, but without sacrificing anything in terms of data quality. From this device, you get heart rate variability. Of course, you get the full ECG. From the time variation of the amplitude of the R peak, you get the respiration rate. We also have a clinical grade temperature sensor that captures the skin temperature, at the chest location. But that doesn't provide everything. You still need blood oxygenation. And one point here is that if you can't get rid of all of the wires, there's very limited utility in just getting rid of a few of them. So we had to go off and build a separate device to measure blood oxygenation. And this is another battery-free wireless system. It's optoelectronics. In this case, it's an optical interface using well-established approaches for determining oxygenation using red and IR LEDs and backscattered light captured by a photodetector and continuously streamed wirelessly in the form of photoplethysmography, and from that data you can extract SpO2. Those 2 devices are operating in a time synchronized fashion, so you can also pick up information related to hemodynamics, so pulse arrival time, for example, which can be converted in some cases to systolic blood pressure. So you can put it all together. We have approval, and we're in the NICU here at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago on a very regular basis. I think we've done about 120 premature babies at this point, no adverse events. Devices are working extremely well. They are not FDA approved, but we're pushing through that process currently. And all of the data that we're capturing is being captured wirelessly with these skin-like devices simultaneously with the standard wired-based infrastructure and technology. This is a 31-week gestational age baby. You can see the device on the chest, the hand there. That's the head of neonatology here at Lurie Children's Hospital. Aaron Hombus is a key collaborator in this space. So things are going extremely well in the NICU. We've also expanded now into the PICU. Older babies, but in a lot of cases, they require the same level of monitoring. Again, getting rid of the wires has a huge advantage for that patient population as well, as illustrated here in a period of what's known here in the US at least is kangaroo mother care. This is skin-to-skin contact between mother and child, known to be very powerful. You get the wires out of the picture, it's much easier to do this. And you can see the unit measuring SpO2 on the foot, the chest unit measuring ECG continuously, and chest temperature. And so this has been a great project. The babies are happy, the mothers are happy, the nurses, the neonatologists, pediatricians, and my students are very, very excited about it as well. This is a nice picture to sort of illustrate, again, the skin-like mechanics that are essential to the engineering foundations of these devices. The baby in this case is turning around to look at the photographer. As he does so, natural wrinkles develop in the skin of the back. And you can see this device, in this case, mounted on the back. You can capture a high-quality ECG from the back. It turns out to be an interesting level of optionality here. And you can see the device just follows the natural wrinkling of the skin without any mechanical constraint. It's very important for allowing robust adhesion without strong adhesives. And it also eliminates any kind of physical perception of the presence of the device. And so it goes on, you forget that it's even there, and the babies don't provide any indication that they know there's a device on their skin. So very powerful. Here's what some of the Bland-Altman plots look like for just the basic data coming out of these platforms. Heart rate, SpO2 is 4 million data points, well within FDA guidelines in terms of precision. And here again, we're comparing and benchmarking against clinical gold standards, wired-based systems. But now that you have sort of a framework and a foothold in the most demanding area of the hospital, in the NICU, you can begin to think about taking those platforms and adding additional functionality, thinking about a NICU of the future where you're doing not only sort of the standard stuff, but you're capturing novel biomarkers and maybe even more aggressive measurements that aren't done routinely. So for example, continuous pulse-to-pulse measurement of blood pressure. Very difficult to get an arterial line into a premature baby, but with the hemodynamics information that we can capture with our time-synchronized patches, we can measure pulse arrival time, pulse transit time, pulse wave velocity, and with the calibration factor, in many cases, that PAT-derived systolic blood pressure tracks nicely an arterial line, as demonstrated on a patient in the PICU in this slide. So this is the first paper, just published, a year and a half ago. And I just want to highlight here that in order to make this stuff work, and as an engineer, it's very important for us to work directly with the clinical community because we want to address real needs, real unmet gaps in capabilities. And you really can't do that unless you're fully embedded in that medical community. And so in this particular case, we have 45 co-authors, not just engineers across all traditional disciplines in engineering science, but clinical medicine as well, dermatology, neonatology, pediatrics, and so on. As a practical matter, we found that the most important people are the nurses because they know what's really going on, in terms of routine care of patients and getting their feedback and adapting the engineering designs to respond to their requests and their ideas turn out to be very powerful. And we have 3 NICU nurses as co-authors on this paper as well. So that's kind of where we are in terms of deployments here in Chicago. We have a couple of other children's hospitals that we're working with in the U.S. Ultimately, you have to think about sustainability. I think it's an important topic of this forum event. And there we were very fortunate that Bill Gates got personally interested in these technologies. I had a chance meeting with him about a year and a half ago, and we're talking about monitoring and so on. And he provided a large grant to fund the sort of industrialization, commercialization of these platforms and their deployment into LMICs. And the Gates Foundation paired with the Save the Children Foundation to put together resources that have allowed us to build out devices at a commercial level for scale deployment into India, Pakistan, Zambia, Kenya, and Ghana through the end of this calendar year and into 2021 as well. And so with that effort, we really had to change some of the designs of the devices I just described to you to make them manufacturable, squeeze out all of the cost that you possibly can, and sort of ruggedize them for deployment in these low resource settings. And so this turns out to be very, very successful. I spent a few weeks in Zambia myself back in December. And what's shown here on the cover of Nature Medicine is a publication on that technology designed specifically for, resource-constrained areas of the globe. And you're seeing there is this kangaroo care again. And this turns out to be even more important in places like Zambia, where they don't have incubators and isolettes. Having the mother sort of engage with the child at this level turns out to be absolutely critical, for the healthy development of the baby. And so embedding not only sort of ruggedized, low-cost designs, but actually layering on additional functionality that's important in these contexts allow you to think about, the utility of these devices in those parts of the globe, but also, again, envisioning a NICU of the future. So this kangaroo mother care, KMC, is so very important. Being able to sort of track when that kind of care is occurring by using orientation sensors, accelerometers on the chest unit will allow us to determine what the baby is doing at any given moment. And then we can correlate how the vital signs respond to that kind of kangaroo mother care. And in this case, you see sharp increases in SpO2 during that engagement. You see much less differential temperature between the limb and the chest. You get an equalization of the temperature, and the heart rate responds accordingly as well. And so this is a lot of data that could lead to new insights and new optimized ways to care for these babies, but other sort of novel biomarkers as well. And we have a high bandwidth accelerometer in that chest unit. It gets not only body orientation, but it can capture crying time and tonality associated with crying. It's not a microphone. You're actually measuring vibrational signatures of crying from the skin. So it's immune to ambient noise. So you can sort of quantify and capture data around crying events as a class of vocal biomarker that might be important in the future. So this is the current status of deployment. We're in 17 countries. We have funding not only from the Gates and the Save the Children foundations, but in NIH, we have a partnership with Draeger and Anthem and BARDA here in the US. And so this is moving beyond my academic group here at Northwestern into a very small, tight, lean, engineering-oriented company called Cybele. So full disclosure, I don't have day-to-day responsibilities there, but I'm heavily committed to making this work, and we need a commercialization vehicle like that in place in order to do this sort of deployment. So that's kind of the status of where we are. So just in terms of numbers, we've done about 100 newborns and more than 1,000 pregnant women in LMICs up to this point. We hope to be able to do 15,000 by the end of 2021, maybe 500 neonates, approaching a terabyte worth of data. And we have great partners across the African continent, including the African Academy of Sciences. So this is a very high priority effort for us, focusing not only on neonates, but on maternal and fetal health as well throughout the intrapartum period. Where there's a lot of mortality, quite frankly, and you like to bring sensor technology to bear to help to reduce those levels of mortality. This is just an example of the kind of big, high-quality data that comes from these studies. This is 487 pregnant women during delivery, throughout the entire process of delivery in Zambia. Just multimodal. You can look at correlations between different effects, and there's a lot of insights that can be pulled from this data. So I think I have about 10 minutes left. Let me talk about other technologies that are beginning to enter this translational pipeline that we expect to be deploying at scale in the near future. And I won't go through all the details. We have a skin interface flow sensor for measuring flow of cerebrospinal fluid through shunts that are used to treat hydrocephalus, primarily pediatrics there, but a very quick, non-invasive way to assess shunt function. We have pediatric wireless NIRS devices, same type of engineering principles, but built around NIRS for wireless monitoring from the forehead. Fetal ECG, we have those deployed already in Africa. Monitoring technologies for swallow and speech in the context of aphasia and dysphagia. I'll get into some details there. We also have wireless neonatal EEG. That's being funded by Gates as well. Not yet deployed into Africa, but that will happen in the next 3 to 6 months. Then we have devices that we're using at Lurie Children's Hospital, again, to monitor surgical recovery in a pediatric surgical ward. But let me say a little bit more about this device for aphasia and dysphagia. And that idea here is, again, the other end of that age spectrum, thinking about stroke survivors whose stroke has affected their ability to speak and to swallow. These are very serious conditions. Those types of patients are treated here in Chicago through a clinic called the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. It's a rehabilitation clinic. And we've been working with the rehabilitation scientists there to develop a technology that will allow them to track swallowing and talking behaviors in their patients when they're outside of the clinic, because a lot of the rehab leads to improvements in the clinic, but those improvements dissipate as the patients go home. So we like a way to sort of non-invasively measure swallow events, relative to respiratory cycle, and total talk time, talk cadence, talk tonality, but without all of the invasiveness in terms of privacy that would follow from the use of a microphone. So it's back to this high bandwidth accelerometer, in this case mounted on an unusual part of the anatomy, fundamentally enabled by the skin-like soft characteristics of these devices, and that is the suprasternal notch. It's the soft tissue location at the base of the neck, just above where the collarbones meet. Here's some raw data that shows kind of how the swallowing monitoring sort of works. So you can see this is just representative data of a patient at rest. And what you see are these cycles, those are respiration cycles, and then what looks like a bunch of noise, sort of fuzzy stuff sitting on top of the baseline signal. That's not noise. Those are cardiac sounds picked up by this device. It's close enough to the carotid artery. You can actually pick up the lub-dub associated with each cardiac cycle. So you can apply digital filtering techniques to that data, subtract out the cardiac signals, which is what you see in the second graph from the top there, leaving only the respiration and what look like direct delta functions. Those are actually swallowing events. So you can count swallow events. It's very high signal noise here, but the swallows at the relative points of the respiratory cycle. So you want to swallow at the peak of inspiration or expiration, not in between. And that's one problem that a lot of these stroke survivors have, is they forget when to swallow relative to the respiration cycle. And you can see that kind of information immediately from these devices. But the point is, at the suprasternal notch, it's a very high information content part of the body. So you can capture not only speech and swallowing and heart rate, which I described to you, respiration rate as well, but respiratory sounds. You can capture sounds and intensity associated with coughing, sleep dynamics, orientation, motion, steps, and so on. And so in March, a large fraction of the clinical community here in Chicago who are aware of our work on dysphagia and aphasia, these devices I just described to you, reached out to us and asked whether we could adapt that device, customize it to address the key symptoms associated with COVID-19, which are fever, cough, and shortness of breath. Well, we figured we could do cough really easily. We can get respiratory activity. We can get shortness of breath. All we had to do is add a temperature sensor and some algorithms to parse out the coughs, and we were able to deliver a device that was really tailor-made to COVID-19, not only the patients, but the frontline healthcare workers to pick up early signs of symptoms. I'll give you an idea of how that works. For this type of application, I think lots of other sorts of applications of biosensor devices, you want to minimize the burden on the patient. Not only sort of the physical burden of the device on the skin, I already talked about that, trying to design in soft mechanics to eliminate interface stresses that can cause skin irritation, but also the user interface, especially these COVID patients. They have no patience, no ability to sort of navigate an app and menus and so on. So we built the device to operate in a totally automated fashion. You put it on the body. As soon as it measures body temperature, it turns on and starts recording. When you take the device off, you put it on a charging pad, it's wirelessly charged. It will automatically initiate a wireless data download process to a tablet, Bluetooth-enabled tablet, which then sends the data automatically up to a HIPAA-compliant cloud server where we run all the analytics on the data. So we've been engaged in 20 weeks of deployment, about 250 subjects, not only patients, as I mentioned, but also nurses, physicians, rehabilitation specialists, about 10,000 hours of data corresponding to about 1 terabyte. So this is what it looks like. There's a dashboard that runs on the cloud, allows the physician to sort of track coughing dynamics, for example, not tracked at all, even in the hospital. It's an important, physiological, process, but it's not tracked. We can do that very easily. We can count coughs. We can measure the intensity of coughs. All this kind of data appears on a dashboard, so a physician and nurse can sort of track the patient status as well as the status of the staff to try to pick up very early signs of infection. And these are deployed in Northwestern Medical Hospital and Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. This is one typical patient. This is actually a nurse caught COVID treating patients. She only has one lung. So we started monitoring her the day that she was admitted into the hospital, and then 4 weeks after that time point. So while she was in the hospital, it got very serious, almost admitted to the ICU, very narrowly avoided that, eventually released to the home, and we continued to monitor her for weeks after that. So you get tremendous amounts of data. We can see transient periods of tachycardia. We can see decays in cough frequency. from a peak frequency of about 250 coughs per hour to very small amounts of coughs after she's been recovered. We've also been able to pick up a previously undiagnosed sleep apnea that was subsequently studied through a targeted sleep study. Anyway, tremendous amounts of data here on patient status. But I mentioned also that because we can count coughing events, intensity of cough, we can measure talking time, talking volume, laughing. All of these activities are producing aerosols. We can correlate, in a rough sense at least, these kinds of processes with total aerosol production. So you can maybe think about measuring a level of infectiousness of an individual patient. But some of these COVID patients are coughing at very high frequencies, others hardly at all. And so this is another use case around this type of device. So let me conclude by giving you a sense of where we're going next with this type of platform. For right now, we're doing it for tracking early symptoms, monitoring a progression of a patient through various stages of the disease, quantifying their response to novel therapeutics, and then monitoring them after they've been released into a home setting to sort of pick up if there's any rapid deterioration, can pull them back into the hospital. But the other thing that you might consider is the use of the device as a disease diagnostic, as an alternative or a complement to kind of molecular diagnostics that are used today. And so in this case, what we're doing is we're measuring all of these different signals from this device on the suprasternal notch during a period of rest, with deep breathing, during a period of walking, gait, back to deep breathing, post-gait, rest, and then a forced cough. And so you can measure changes in respiration rate, SpO2, heart rate, before and after walking events. And fatigability is an important metric to think about in this context. And so we've done about 200 participants, healthy normals, as well as infected patients in a hospital setting. And with the principal component analysis, it splits out very clearly. And so what we're now trying to do is determine the extent to which this kind of platform can be used to measure people who are very mildly symptomatic or perhaps nominally asymptomatic. And that's kind of a direction that we're going with this technology. So I think I'm pretty much on time. I'm just going to conclude by trying to make the argument that technology is going to be very important for a future of sustainable healthcare, better outcomes for patients, lower costs. Digital data is going to be key to that, and device platforms that are compliant with patients and minimize burden on the user. So big data, clinical quality, configured for deployment to all regions of the globe for all patients. So I'll conclude by acknowledging senior collaborators. I mentioned that I'm an engineer, but that clinical medical interface is extremely important. So we collaborate with lots of folks in engineering science, but the key is to understand the clinical needs and to develop devices that address those needs. And we're fortunate to have great collaborators across all areas of the medical complex here in Chicago, and I want to acknowledge those folks. And just conclude, I'm an academic. I run an academic research group here. We're interested in translation and startups, but my main emphasis is on the students. We have great postdocs, PhD students, MD students embedded in the group, undergrads as well. I appreciate all the funding sources that have supported this work over the years, and I thank you for your attention.
John, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating and extremely exciting, and wonderful example of sophisticated engineering being applied to solve clinical problems. You've stuck beautifully to time, so we can take a few minutes for questions very specifically on the content of what John said. Store up your more general questions, if you would, for the Q&A session that will follow the other speakers. So I'm going to be picking up some questions from the chat bar. If I could just start, maybe, John, with asking you about something you haven't touched on, and that is the potential of these technologies to sample and measure blood constituents. Where does that stand and where's it going?
Yeah, that's a really great question. All of the sensors that I described in the presentation sort of operate on physics principles. It's optical interfaces, it's mechanical, electrical interfaces, and so on. I think getting biochemical based information around health status is the real frontier, I would say, in this area of biomedical engineering. We're a little bit reluctant to develop devices that involve invasiveness at the level of penetrating the skin. I think ultimately you'd like to have access to blood, but infection risks and risks of pain. It makes it much harder to get approval for human subject studies. And so as an alternative, we've been deep in exploring sweat as a relatively underexplored class of biofluid, but one that has a wide range of biomarkers embedded in it. So we have platforms for measuring not just simple things like electrolyte levels, but we have colorimetric chemical reagents that allow us to assess urea, creatinine, lactate, glucose, many different chemical species in sweat. And the advantage, obviously, with sweat is it can be captured completely non-invasively. There are various ways to induce sweating. It's not a problem. It applies from pediatrics all the way to elderly patients. I think the open question there is how tightly correlated is sweat chemistry to blood chemistry? And we're deep in to a set of clinical studies that are examining that question. In some cases, there are good correlations. Caffeine and alcohol, for example, and sweat are known to correlate very tightly with the concentrations in blood. Glucose is a little bit looser in terms of that correspondence. Urea, creatinine, not known, but important in the assessment of kidney health, for example. So that's the approach that we've taken. It may not be a substitute for blood in all cases, but it appears to us to be kind of an interesting, non-invasive way to think about biochemical, markers of health status.
Yeah. Thanks. There's a question come in, can these epidermal biosensors be used to deliver stimuli? So thinking about rehabilitation, stroke and nerve injury and so on.
Yeah, another fantastic question. It's a great group here, obviously. So we've been thinking about therapy, right? So if you can deliver sort of a kind of therapeutic benefit, you're qualitatively in a different regime of impact than sensing, right? Sensing is great, but you want to be able to provide therapy. And so I guess what we've started to look at is probably the simplest form of therapeutic feedback is haptic. And so for these devices on the suprasternal notch, the patient needs to know when they swallowed at the wrong time, and just a little haptic vibration at that point. It's great. It works. We can also alert them if they have not swallowed frequently enough during a certain time period. So, probably a really simple example of therapy, but it's good to start simple, I think in a lot of ways. And that's an example of kind of a stimulus, I guess, that's being applied to the body. And it avoids, issues with electrical stimuli, which can vary over a wide range depending on the impedance of the skin at any given moment, which is affected by sweating and other things. So we like just a little mechanical perturbation. It's great for rehabilitation, maybe some other applications as well. But yeah, that's kind of what we're doing along those lines.
I'll perhaps just take one or two more. So there's a question about whether there's a potential to measure body composition or energy expenditure. Yeah, we can do pretty well by measuring change in heart rate. We're measuring temperature of the body. We're also measuring overall body motion. I mean, accelerometer on the wrist is okay, but this doesn't indicate, real energy expenditure. So I think being coupled to the core of the body, which you get from being on the suprasternal notch or the chest units I was talking about before, I think probably provide a much more relevant metric of physical activity. We're using that in the context of surgical recovery in a pediatric surgical ward, Lurie Children's, as an alternative to kind of the wristband actigraph systems. And we'll see how that plays out. But that's our thought right now. We can quantify all the physics, relating that to calories burned and so on. Probably there are correlations there. We haven't done a lot of work along those lines, but it's probably promising direction to think about. So maybe the final question for now, we may come back to this sort of theme later. So the question is asking about the biggest barriers to adoption. Is it technical challenges, equivalent performance, or cost? So just a word about the barriers and the cost equation. I mean, clearly, if these technologies allow care at home and avoid hospital admission or reduced length of stay, there's a very obvious value equation. But what's the upfront cost? Yeah. So in terms of cost, we had to do a deep dive on the bill of materials in the context of the Gates program, because that foundation won't fund things that aren't
from a cost standpoint, deployable into regions of the world that they are sort of targeting. So you really have to think about cost per patient day, and the devices can be sterilized and reused. And so we end up with a few cents per patient day. That's the cost today. But the volume really dictates the cost. And the other thing that we've done is we engineered these devices explicitly to align with manufacturing practice that's already in place to support the consumer electronics gadgetry industry. And that industry is moving forward very quickly, has been for the last 50 years, and it will continue to. And so I think over time, with increased volumes, with decreased costs, which is a trend line that's been present in electronic gadgets for a long time, I think you can expect nothing other than continued rapid reductions in cost. And so I don't feel that cost or manufacturability are impediments. I think a lot of this stuff is going to happen. I don't see any severe roadblocks. I don't know if we're going to be the ones who drive it or other groups. There's a lot of momentum building. I think specifically because of the pandemic, it's led to a very heightened awareness of what can be done in a home setting in terms of clinical grade monitoring. And if there's any sort of silver lining here, that may be one of them, to kind of rethink how to reduce costs by getting a lot of the monitoring into the home and making it available to all communities. I think that sort of high quality data for all is something that we're very interested in as well.